Hello everyone, greetings from Scotland. I was asked to give you an update on the Brexit process. We now have under 5 weeks to go until exit day, and the situation can only be described as a mess. Under Article 50 of the EU Treaty, once a member state has notified its intention to withdraw from the EU, which the UK did on the 29th of March 2017, it has 2 years in which to negotiate terms of withdrawal, including a framework for its future relationship with the EU. If no agreement is reached, it will automatically cease to be a member when the 2-year period expires, so on 29th of March of this year. This would mean that our existing relationship with the EU would abruptly end, with no new relationship or transitional period in place. The only alternatives are either to seek an extension to the negotiating period, which requires the unanimous agreement of the other 27 EU member states, or the withdrawing state can unilaterally revoke its withdrawal notification, but that has to be an unequivocal decision to remain in the EU and not merely a means of buying extra time. The UK government and the EU negotiators eventually reached a withdrawal agreement and political declaration on the future UK-EU relationship in November last year. But in order to be ratified, that has to be agreed both by the European Parliament and by the House of Commons. Alas, when the Commons eventually voted on the 15th of January, the deal was rejected by 230 votes, the biggest government defeat in modern parliamentary history. Following that defeat, a further vote was required on the 29th of January to consider the government's response. Its position remains that the result of the EU referendum has to be respected, and so the only choices are to leave on the 29th of March, either with the deal that's been negotiated or with no deal. MPs weren't happy with either of these options, and amendments were passed first to rule out a no-deal Brexit, and second to mandate the government to renegotiate the most controversial part of the withdrawal agreement, which is the so-called Northern Irish backstop, designed to prevent a hard border between the north and south of Ireland. Both of these amendments were problematic. The EU has consistently refused to reopen the deal, and since a no-deal Brexit is currently the default option, something positive has to intervene to stop it happening. It's also worth pointing out that for the UK to leave on 29th of March either with or without a deal requires a good deal of primary and secondary legislation to be passed, and that still has to be enacted. So in these circumstances, either extending Article 50 or cancelling Brexit altogether looks pretty attractive, but these are problematic too. In the first place, attempts so far by MPs to take control of the Brexit process so as to require an extension or revocation of Article 50 have failed, although there will be another attempt to do so this week. Secondly, it seems unlikely that the EU27 would agree an extension of the negotiating period unless there's a prospect of some meaningful change, such as another referendum or a general election. Finally, extension and particularly cancellation of Brexit would cause major political problems of their own. There's no doubt that a significant proportion of the electorate would regard this as a major breach of political trust. Meanwhile, both the government and opposition are in disarray. Last week, a number of MPs broke away from both the Labour and Conservative parties to form a new independent group in Parliament, while collective cabinet responsibility seems to be a distant memory. Remarkably, though, the government survives. Despite losing the withdrawal agreement vote so heavily, a motion of no confidence was defeated 2 days later and would probably be defeated again. This is, I think, due to the lack of a credible and united opposition and the sense that a general election at this stage simply wouldn't help. So, what are the lessons for New Zealand? The Brexit process has been marked by extensive disagreement over the constitutionality of the process. Should the referendum be treated as binding? Should Parliament be able to take control of the process? Is the Northern Irish backstop constitutionally necessary or constitutionally objectionable? This is a reflection of the indeterminacy of the UK's constitutional order. Like New Zealand, we have a famously flexible constitution, and that flexibility means that most arguments about constitutional propriety are misconceived. Parliament can authorise anything it likes, and political practice can change. But I think that constitutional flexibility sometimes blinds us to an equally important question of constitutional effectiveness. There was nothing constitutionally improper about calling a referendum on EU membership and treating the result as binding. But in circumstances where this forces the political classes to do something that the majority disagrees with, in the face of a narrow and territorially divided result, and where there are irreconcilable negotiating objectives, it has predictably failed to resolve the constitutional question of what the UK's relationship with Europe should be. Similarly, in the absence of an effective government policy on Brexit, there's nothing constitutionally improper about calling for Parliament to take control. But without being able to provide a clear alternative policy in the form of a credible alternative government, Parliament is not taking control, but rather pushing us towards a potentially disastrous no-deal Brexit. So the lesson for New Zealand is to think carefully before you mess around with the Constitution. Meanwhile, I'm off to buy some tin food to add to my Brexit stockpile. Goodbye.